It's Pete from Cheap Homesteading, and I'm in the garage today and I'm working on the Massey 231. We're going to try to get the crank in, connecting rods and pistons. We're going to check them with plastic gauge, get it all set up. So let's go. I flipped the block upside down. It makes it a lot easier to put the crank in and out and check with the plastic gauge and everything. And put a block of wood in between the studs so the studs wouldn't dig into the pallet and be a little bit tippier. Okay, so here is the old crank, here's the new crank. The old crank has the balancer weights on it. We are going to transfer that over, but first we're going to get this crank in there with the new bearings and check the plastic gauge, make sure it is perfect, and then we'll put it on so I don't have to lift the extra weight. Well, first we're going to remove the old bearings. And if you notice, there's a wide one, narrow, narrow, not as wide one. Okay, so we're going to clean this up. We're just going to wipe it down. And we're going to put the new bearings in. Okay, so we have the new main bearing set. We are going to be careful with these. Okay, so I'm going to lay them out on a clean rag and we are going to start installing them. When it's all said and done, you got to make sure your loopholes match up. It's kind of hard to put them in backwards, but what if they gave you the wrong bearings? So you just make sure each one, when it's installed, has a loophole that lines up. Okay, so I got the bearing halves in place. So it is really important to make sure that you put the main bearings back in the same location. With this engine, it is a little harder to put them in wrong because the back bearing and the front bearing are different sizes. It's only the middle ones you can mess up. So each bearing has a number, and the front of the engine is C1, connecting main bearing, C2, C3, C4. So this is the back one, and this is C4. So make sure you put them in and don't get them mixed up. So right here is the tab. And that lines up with the tab on the main bearing. And you put it in. Okay, so I will go to the next one. Came out easy. Shove those into place. Okay, so there you go. We are ready. So basically, the thrust bearing goes in this recess in the outside of the block. I always put just a tiny dab of grease just to hold it there or it'll just fall out. I'm going to do that with the inside too. And it kind of just sticks it in place. Okay, so we're going to wipe down the crankshaft journals with a clean rag. Make sure they're all clean. Okay, so I want to put just a little bit of engine oil on the main bearings. Engine oil. Down gently. I am going to gently set this down on the bearings. Right there. Okay, so I don't know what's wrong, but the crank is way too tight. So we're gonna pull it out and we're gonna measure it up and see what's going on. So that's here. This job is getting worse and worse by the minute. I went to put the crank in. You could tell something was wrong. I couldn't I couldn't pull the crank down into the journals. They were sitting like caught on the edge, like it was too big of a crank to go down in the hole, which isn't normal. So I pulled it back out. So I looked at the bearings and you can see 10 thou. So these bearings are used if you cut down the crank 10 thou. But this crank is standard still. So that's why it won't fit with the 10 thou bearings. So I'm gonna have to make a few calls. I'm gonna figure out what's wrong and get this rectified. So that is about enough for tonight. The main bearings finally came in, so we can start reassembly. This job, for some reason, has just been, there's been one thing after another, but I feel good about it now. We are going to finish installing the crank, so let's go. So there you go. The main bearings are here, and they say standard, so we're good. It's kind of cool to see what newspapers, it says this thing's from England, but it's got like the Globe and Mail. October 20th, 2018. I'd say that was packed in North America. Anyways, okay, so we're going to open up these bearings. I don't know if you can see that, but it says standard. I went over how to install these things in the first part of the video. The first bearings were wrong, but the way I told you to install them is right, so just follow it. Okay, so we're going to throw these in. The main thing is to make sure that the loopholes are lined up with the bearings. It's easy to get these right. If you look at the last bearing, if you were to put that there, it wouldn't have a loophole, so don't make that mistake. Put some engine oil. So I'm just going to put a light layer on here. So now we're going to look at the crank. So it's really important to blow out all the loopholes. You don't want a filing from when they were making the crank to go through your main bearings. So just make sure you blow them out. I do that on here too. I give it a little bit. And I just wipe it off. Okay, so I have my thrust bearings in, and my other bearings are sitting there. Be careful when you set this down. That sits down beautifully. When you set the crank down, you want it just to easily fall all the way into the bottom of the bore. When I had the 10,000th over, it would get caught on the top edges, and there was a gap down there, so I just knew it was wrong. Okay, we're going to set the rear main bearing, which has the thrust washers, down gently. and everything fits real nice. So we'll just keep putting the other bearings in. For some reason, if an engine is not marked, you have to make sure that you know which one this comes out of. When they make the block, they line bore it with these caps in here, so it's perfect. If you move the cap from here to here, it's not quite perfect. So you're going to run into a little bit of issue. Crank main bearing 2. Main bearing 1. And if you look, the two outside ones are longer because the cap is higher. Don't get them mixed up. You want to make sure that the crank turns. I haven't tightened these down yet, but if the bearings are too tight, you'll almost not be able to turn it, or it'll be really stiff, but that feels real good. So we are going to do the plastic gauge and keep on rolling. Okay, so main bearing clearance should be 1/1000 to 4/1000 of an inch. So we're going to check that with the plastic gauge. This is plastic gauge. It's just a really fine, thin piece of plastic, and you put it on the main bearings. You torque it down, and when you take them out, you see how much it crushes the plastic. And whichever one it matches to the thickness is how thick it is. So if it's this thick, it's 1/1000 of an inch. So it's the only way you can find out bearing clearance. I'm going to do the main bearing here. Okay, so you take a piece and you lie it across. And you set your main bearing down on it. And after I do them all, we'll torque them and remove them and then see what the plastic gauge is. I always do that. That's crazy. So you want to screw them pretty much by hand, and you go back and forth. You want the cap to go down evenly. Don't tighten one side down and leave the other up on the edge, because it may not actually ever go down to its proper location. So you kind of tighten up both till it goes down flush. We'll get the torque wrench. Main bearing screws, 110 foot-pounds. For you guys that don't know, a torque wrench gives a specific amount of torque. And there's little increments, and you screw it up till 110. And then you put a little lock and it stays there. And when you start torquing it, you torque it evenly. And when it hits the actual torque, it will click. There you go. So there you go, it's torqued. Okay, so you just gently tap, gently tap, gently tap. There we go. That should just come out. And it can either stick to here or here, and sometimes both. You use your plastic gauge wrapper and you line it up. It's smaller than that, smaller than that. It's almost perfect. So that's 2/1000ths of an inch. So the allowable was 1 to 4, so it's all good. So I'll check all the other ones. Okay. Okay, so we'll check 2/1000ths of an inch, dead on. Throw some oil and put the cap back on and keep rolling down the line. Two-thousandths of an inch. It's actually 3/1000ths of an inch, that one. It's just a hair different. Still in the allowable though. The allowable is 1 to 4. Okay, so we're going to retorque them. It won't have to be taken off again. And you know what? I get a little stressed when I go over it one more time just to make sure that they're torqued. I don't know if everyone does that, but it's like when you leave your house and you wonder if you locked the door. You know that you did, but you still wonder. So I set up in my mind things that I just know that I've done. I always double check my torques, so I know that it's good. So there you go, the crank's installed and I should be able to turn it pretty easy. So now that you got the crank installed, we know that the clearance is good and everything, but now we got to check the end play. So that's what your thrust washers do. It keeps it from going back and forth. If it's too tight, it's no good. If it's too loose, it's no good. So we're going to check the specs. Crankshaft end clearance is 2 to 15/1000ths of an inch. That's quite a spread, but I'll show you 2 to 15/1000ths. So what we use is a dial indicator. This one's a cheap one. It's like one you'd buy at Princess Auto or wow, that's on there, something else. Princess Auto or something like that. So basically how you do this, you pry the crank this way. You loosen off this little jam nut, you put it to 0 there, you tighten that up, then you pry it to the other direction, and you have 5, 6, 6.5, 7/1000ths of an inch, which is perfect because that's right in the middle of, what does it say, 2,000 to 15/1000ths of an inch. So you know your end play on your crank is perfect. You don't need every single tool in the world because some people take it to a whole new level. They really do. They buy everything, but they can't fix nothing. So you got to be smart about it. Tools are expensive. Okay, so the end clearance is good and the main bearings are good. That's all installed, so we can start assembling the rods. So here's one. Okay, so that side. I'll throw some oil on there. Should go together relatively easy. You shouldn't have to pound them in. There is some that you kind of have to, but these should go in relatively easy. You should be able to put them in with your hand. Okay, so we got the rings. These people are nice to set them out in the right orientation. So I have found that it's almost easier just to gently work it over the piston than have those little ring spreaders. So one thing I want to caution you is not to spread the ring too much. You basically just want it to go over. You don't want to spread the ring way more than it needs to be. You want to spread the ring just enough to get it over. So we go get the next ring. That's why, I don't know, I find it easier with my fingers. Just don't go crazy with the ring. And when you're done, look on the edge of the ring and see top, top, and top, and then you know it's all good. So we move to the next one. We threw the rod bearings in. They have the same little lineup tabs. Make sure they're in, and there's no loopholes, so you don't have to worry about that. Now we have to look in the book and see if they have a location for these ring slots. Normally, you don't want them lined up for sure. But some companies, you have to have exactly the locations where they want them. Nowhere in here does it actually show the specific location for the rings. So I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rings. I can't worry about this one so much. But I'm going to try to put a ring gap, ring gap, ring gap, ring gap. So see this? I'm going to put one here. I'm going to put one somewhere here. I'm going to move this around. I'm going to put one over here, and I'm going to put one here. So see? Ring gap, ring gap, ring gap, ring gap. And I think this one here I can't really worry about because you got too many rings trying to make that fit. I'm going to give a light coating of engine oil to the cylinders. So when the pistons go in, they can go in nice and clean. Take the cap off. We're going to put a little bit of oil on this one. Okay, so your combustion hole, the side that is closer to goes away from your cam. So this is a snap-on ring compressor. You can use any ring compressor, and you can go to like Princess Auto or any other place to get it. Now, we're going to give it a gentle tap. Okay. The problem with these pistons, they have a ring that's lower. So we've got that one started. So now we move to the top rings. And normally you would hit in the center, but I want to make sure that I'm not hitting my crank when the rod goes down with the studs. Oh my. So there you go. One is in. You do not want to force too much or hammer too much. You want it to kind of go gently into the location. I'm gonna have to tip this back on its side. Now you push the piston in with the rod and make sure that you don't hit the studs on the crank surface. And don't hammer it. You should be able to push that by hand. And you match up your marks. So my mark's on the far side. You install the cap. Just put the nuts on loosely, just till they're snug. And then we'll move on to the next cylinder. I'm gonna tip this back up. Would be easier with an engine stand for sure. Slide this in gently. Okay, so we roll up the pistons, each one to the top, and make sure that it doesn't stick up past the edge of the block. We are actually going to check that dimension after, but I want to make sure that there was nothing wrong or something like that before we yeah. This is exactly the same way you check and plastic gauge the mains as you do the rods. We're going to put this one to the very top. Okay, so we got more of this plastic gauge. Got to be sparing, I'm almost running out. We'll take this nut, loosen it off. Make sure the rod and piston doesn't fall. We're going to set that there. Make sure that's on the right way. And we're going to tighten this up. So with these two, you want to kind of go evenly. There we go. Pull these off. Slide this out. Okay, so there you go. See, it's 2/1000ths of an inch. So we are dandy. So we'll put this cap back on. And we will do the final torque. And then move on to the next one. Okay. So we're gonna roll it over to the next one. We got the crank in, the rods in, and they're all been plastic gauged, they're all good. And I've just ran out of time, so I gotta go in. So you guys have a good one.